My name is Jackson Privet, and today I'm going to be discussing the findings from my most recent athlete monitoring project with. Before we begin, let me give you a background on both the athletes I work with during the time span of this project and the competition they currently compete in. The project was participated by 20 state level youth rugby league athletes with ages ranging from 15 to 18 years old. All the participants in the study are currently students in high school, with majority of them on sports scholarships or enrolled in private education. This means that as a requirement, the athletes represent both their school in sport as well as our representative rugby league side, which can bring along some challenges as I will discuss later. The majority of participants are based in Sydney, New South Wales. However, there are also external athletes who have been selected from regional areas to represent our side. All the participants are part of an extended 40 youth athlete squad who have just commenced preseason training and are vying for a place in the final 25-man roster. The club in which all participants play for are part of a statewide competition. The competition can require large amounts of travelling dependent on opposition. The preseason, which is commenced shortly before the beginning of this project, lasts for approximately 4 months, in which within that the team plays a number of trial games. At the conclusion of each trial game, the squad is trimmed by a few players up until the final 25 have been selected. The representative season lasts around 2 to 3 months. For my athlete monitoring project, I developed a wellness questionnaire. The questionnaire was developed through the online service Google Forms. I chose Google Forms for a number of options, including but not limited to its ease of access and functionality. Its data is remotely stored, meaning I would be able to access it from any device with an internet connection. The data was easily able to be exported for my detailed analysis, and the program provides instant feedback, meaning I was able to implement the appropriate interventions, if need be, prior to the commencement of training. The questionnaire consisted of 11 different categories that would be filled out by each individual athlete. The categories were listed as follows: weight, height, mood, fatigue, soreness, stress, sleep duration, sleep quality, nutrition, hydration, and readiness. Within each category, the athlete selected a number on the scale of 1 to 5, with 1 representing the best option and 5 representing the worst. Each selection also had a small description so that athletes would know what each number meant. Prior to the commencement of the project, I seek consent from all athletes over the age of 18. Whilst I seek consent, the guardians or parents of all athletes under the age of 18. Once consent was obtained, each player would step into a small isolated room to minimize the effect of peer influence on data obtained. As they arrived at the facility prior to training, the athlete would measure their height and weight and then complete the wellness questionnaire on an iPad in the room. Once he was completed, he would leave the room and the next participant would perform the same process until all 20 athletes had completed. The questionnaire was administered before every training session, meaning therefore each athlete completed the questionnaire 3 times per week. On the left, you can see an example of what the questionnaire looked like, as well as the instant summary page of results. I have also included a screenshot of what the data looks like once it is exported into Excel. As you can see, the dataset has validation rules set within it that highlight any high scores reported by athletes that may be troublesome if not addressed. Over the course of the 8-week project, I collected a wide range of data from a number of participants. From this, I was able to analyze the data sets and find a number of observations regarding the reasoning for some of the responses. I have listed 4 observations in which I found were important to recognize. My first observation was that it was quite obvious that the participants found the first week of training difficult. As shown in the graphs provided, we can see a spike in average soreness ratings reported after the first session. We also see in the total wellness score that the players reported much higher ratings after the initial first session. It is important to note, however, that the average rating of soreness slowly decreased, which could be as a result of the athletes responding to the training stimulus. It was not a surprise that the athletes felt sore after the first session, as many of them had not trained with the required intensity in the months leading up to the commencement of preseason training. However, it was a positive sign that the reported soreness seemed to dissipate fairly quickly, with players reporting low levels at the start of the following week. We did, however, see a spike in fatigue at the start of the following week, as well as a spike in total scores. Therefore, it was important to monitor training load in the upcoming sessions. My second observation from the dataset related to the clear relationship between results shown and external events and stresses. On the slides, I have graphed 3 wellness categories over the course of the 8-week project, which I have identified as important to recovery, that being stress, sleep duration, and sleep quality. As you can see, the data line shown remains stable up until week 5, in which we see a large spike in sleep duration and sleep quality, as well as a moderate spike in stress levels. At the time, I had assumed that it was due to training and performance levels within the team, so I looked into the data a little further, and all the training data seemed relatively fine. There was no immediate spike in training load or anything that could have been accounted for these spikes in wellness readings. From there, I questioned whether the spike was a cause of something outside of training or the team, as players are only with us for 6 to 8 hours per week. So I used the data as a way of opening communication with some of the players, asking why the scores were much higher at this time. This was when I was told that week 5 coincided with exam weeks across all schools. So it made sense. In exam periods, the participants are studying for long hours and stressing as to whether they will get good grades. Such was this revelation that I began to analyze the data, wondering if I was able to find any other instances of external influence. After examining the line graph on the presentation again, I noticed 2 small stress spikes at either end of the graph, which moved in opposite to the other data. Upon analysing the week periods of these spikes, I found that both weeks coincided with trial games being played at the end of that week. Such stress could therefore be put down to either stress for the upcoming game or stress related to the squad cut at the commencement of each game. My third observation is related to the large data set shown on the presentation below. As you may be able to see, across all the data that I have obtained, there seems to be no distinct relationship between individual metrics within the questionnaire. I have chosen data from Athlete 1 as an example here. As you can see on the table provided, there is no consistent correlation between these metrics. Such instances have both positive and negative effects. If you are to believe the data, one would assume that looking at this data set, the athlete must be in great condition and is constantly recovering and adapting to the training stimulus. This would also find reasons behind poor score instances, as communication would determine whatever has caused the poor response. However, such data seems as though athletes are not answering truthfully, which causes issues as to the reliability of the wellness score as a whole. My final observation related to the data obtained when there was no trial game compared to the data obtained after a trial game had been played. Looking at the column graph below, we see average scores of data from weeks in which games were not played compared to weeks in which trial games had been previously played the weekend before. From the data, we see small spikes in both fatigue and soreness. However, other than those 2 metrics, the responses shown indicate that the athletes have been prepared appropriately to cope with the stresses of competitive game conditions. Using the data captured each week, we adjusted our training program in reaction to the responses provided. From our observations, we determined that interventions needed to be made for the greater good of the training program. Some examples of some of the interventions that we made included an emphasis on development of an effective warm-up strategy prior to training, which included foam rolling and mobility work, as well as recovery in post-training, including nutrition, ice baths, contrast bars, etc. This was in relation to our first observation, which was an increase in fatigue and soreness after the first week. The second intervention that we made was conducting weekly individual meetings with players and coaching staff. If we identify an external stressor within the wellness questionnaire, we manage that individual with either a modified training load or rest until that metric returned back to normal. We also gave the athlete decision-making capabilities in terms of deciding which training stimulus they wanted to. This was in relation to the correlation between response and external stresses. Our third intervention that we used was using the instant feedback summary page located in Google Sheets to inform the coaching staff of any outlying responses that required urgent attention. From that, we opened dialogue with the athletes as to the reasoning behind the response, and if the reasoning was impactful to further training, we suggested modified training to the coaching staff. This was in response to the third observation, being that there was no strong relationship between the questionnaire metrics. In relation to our first observation, that being the desirable response after competition, we decided that we didn't need an immediate change. Our management in training load and internal stress was critical after competition. However, we monitored such players through the training session until they returned back to normal or below average responses. Upon reflecting on the use of a wellness questionnaire, I established that it's a useful tool to establish internal coping mechanisms of athletes. Some of the pros of using a wellness questionnaire include the fact that it's easy to administer, it's cost effective, it's sensitive to changes in training effects, it allows avenues to open dialogue with athletes. Some studies that have backed up the use of wellness questionnaires in sport include a study by Gallo, Cormack, Gabbett, and Lorenzen in 2016 that showed that there was a relationship between perceived wellness and external training output. However, some cons of a wellness questionnaire include that some questions can be non-specific. A wellness questionnaire is also easy to manipulate, as seen by Twist and Heighten 2013. And there are some times when we do get resistance from athletes in completing the same questionnaire multiple times throughout a season. Upon reflection, I did see some resistance from the athletes over that 8-week period. However, I was able to get data from them over that whole period. This was possibly due to the length of the questionnaire or the fact that they did not know the relevance of the questionnaire. Some things that have been brought up in Coots and Rayburn 2008. I found that the data provided a good set of analysis in an area where we do not have an extended amount of resources. And I also found that the use of descriptive words within the questionnaire provided clarity in response to what choice the athletes were making within the questionnaire. Recommendations that I would make when using a wellness questionnaire is using 4 to 12 questions within that wellness survey, as shown in Coots and Rayburn. I would also try to administer the questionnaire on days when no training occurs to compare the data. I would establish moving averages for individual players instead of global norms. I would also provide education for each metric prior to the administering to ensure educated responses. And I would analyze with the other data collected, including external loads and competition loads, to determine the validity of the responses.